on behavior management in special education. Please refer to your handout as you follow along with the presentation, and remember to sign your name in the comments and note what area you teach. If you have any questions following the presentation, please feel free to email me at the address listed on the last slide. Thank you for viewing. To fully understand the policies for disciplining students with disabilities, it will help you to have a general understanding of the basic rights of a student with disabilities. IDEA is the federal law which regulates how students with disabilities will be educated in the public schools. It guarantees students with disabilities the right to a free and appropriate education. This means children ages 3 to 21 will be evaluated for their educational needs and, if identified with a disability, will receive an individualized education program at no cost to the parents. Children with disabilities are to be served in their least restrictive environment, meaning the school will provide the necessary supplementary aids and services to educate them in the general education classroom of their home school whenever possible. Students with disabilities should spend as much time as possible with non-disabled peers during academic and non-academic activities. Specially designed instruction, goals and accommodations, and related services determine the student's placement. A student cannot be placed in a certain classroom or program simply based on their disability category. The IEP must be implemented as written unless the team agrees to change and modify the IEP. In other words, one cannot make changes to a student's individualized programming or placement without parental consent. This will be important later when we discuss suspension and expulsion of students with disabilities. All students and parents with disabilities have the right to due process with an impartial hearing officer if they disagree with the school's identification or placement of a student, or if they feel their child is not receiving FAPE in their least restrictive environment. Stay put prevents the child's placement from being changed during due process. The child will continue to receive the services outlined in the current IEP until the hearing officer makes a decision. Students with disabilities are not exempt from disciplinary action, although IDEA sets guidelines to protect students with disabilities from discrimination and denial of FAPE due to the inability to access the required services while removed from school. The guidelines set by IDEA are federally mandated and put in place to protect a student with a disability's educational rights. There are currently 14 disability categories recognized by IDEA, one of which is specific to students with emotional and behavioral issues. Students identified with emotionally disturbed, ED, must have characteristics of a long-standing emotional or psychological impairment which has a negative impact on their academic performance. To qualify a student for this disability category, the evaluating team must rule out that the behaviors are resulting from another disability, environmental factors, or socially learned traits. Students identified with disabilities other than ED can also have behaviors which can be attributed to their disability. For example, autism, intellectual disability, developmentally delay, learning disabled, etc. It is important to keep this in mind because the disciplinary action changes when a student's behavior manifests from their disability, as we'll see in later slides. If the school recommends removal of a student for more than 10 days, the IEP team must hold a manifestation determination within 10 days of the recommendation to remove the child from school. Manifestation determination cannot be a unilateral decision and must involve a team of professionals who are knowledgeable of the student and their disability. The team must review all relevant data to make a decision. The decision of whether the behavior results from the disability cannot be made simply based on the student's disability category. If it is determined the student's behavior is not related to their disability, they will receive the same consequences as a non-disabled peer. They will continue to receive their IEP services and access to the general education curriculum during their suspension. If the team determines the behavior does manifest from the student's disability or the school's failure to implement the IEP properly, the student must be returned to their current placement and specific procedures must be followed. At any time, the team can recommend a functional behavior analysis to determine the cause of a student's behavior. This is a formal assessment and requires parental consent. If during manifestation determination it's determined that the behavior is related to a child's disability, a qualified professional should conduct a functional behavior analysis. During an FBA, a qualified professional observes the student over several days in a variety of settings, looking for patterns that may trigger and reinforce the student to execute that particular behavior. When the behavior is observed, the evaluator will note the antecedent, which is what occurs right before the behavior. The evaluator should use behavioral terms to describe the behavior, meaning they will discuss the actions they observe the child doing. For example, crying, yelling, escaping from class, hitting, etc. And not make judgments about what the child is thinking or feeling. For example, got upset or felt embarrassed. The behaviors observed must be observable. The data is compiled and analyzed so the evaluator can make a hypothesis as to why the student exhibits that behavior. The consequence of the behavior will also be noted. That's what occurs immediately after the behavior. Once the reason for the behavior is identified, school personnel can make adaptations to the student's environment to prevent the behavior or teach student strategies to replace it with something more appropriate. For example, John is a student with behavior impairment. When asked to do work independently at his seat, he exhibits behaviors such as hitting, falling to the floor, crying, and having a tantrum. During an FBA, the evaluator notes that when John is asked to do work independently and seated away from the teacher, he exhibits these behaviors. After he exhibits the behaviors, the teacher leaves her small group to come and try to console John, or the paraprofessional comes in and removes him from the classroom. Based on the data in the functional behavioral analysis, the evaluator feels that the student's exhibiting behavior to escape independent work and seek attention from the teacher. Once a hypothesis is made as to why the student is exhibiting a certain behavior, a behavior intervention plan should be created to decrease, eliminate, or replace the behavior. This plan can include goals, strategies, and positive behavior techniques staff can use before or when the behavior occurs. A BIP should be created by the student's teacher, parent, special education teacher, and support staff, and the BIP should be shared with all personnel who work with the child. Changing a student's behavior requires consistent implementation of strategies by all team members. A BIP needs to be reviewed annually to determine if the student's need changed or still requires the BIP to address that behavior. In the example of John, who was escaping work and receiving teacher attention, seeking teacher attention through his tantruming, a behavior intervention plan could be created to allow him options to ask for help, give the staff strategies to decrease the behavior, perhaps giving him small amounts of work and gradually increasing it over time, seating him near an adult when doing independent work, and using visual supports that would show him that he could access a reinforcer once he completed his work. Those are some examples of strategies that could be implemented through a behavior intervention plan. Talking about suspension, a short fixed-term suspension that does not exceed 10 days can be used with students without needing to proceed with a manifestation determination, FBA, or BIP. Removal from school for up to 10 days is not considered a change in placement or denial of FAPE. However, a student should still be afforded their due process rights when receiving a short suspension. The same rule applies for an accumulated suspension. That's when a student is suspended for more than 10 non-consecutive days or part of the school day because it is considered a unilateral change in placement. The student must continue to receive access to the general education curriculum and IEP services when suspended for greater than 10 days, and a manifestation determination must take place. The 10-day suspension rule also applies when a student is suspended from busing if they have transportation as a related service on their IEP. In other words, they cannot be suspended from busing for more than 10 consecutive or non-consecutive days, and a manifestation determination meeting must be held. If the behavior is a result of the student's disability, an FBA and BIP must be completed. In-school suspension falls into two types. It can exceed 10 days and not be considered a change in placement if the student continues to receive FAPE, and that is when they have access to the general education curriculum and their IEP goals, services, and accommodations while they're in school suspension. In-school suspension cannot exceed 10 days if the student is not receiving FAPE during that time. If the team feels that the student needs to have in-school suspension for greater than 10 days, the procedure of a manifestation determination, development of an FBA and BIP must be put into place. Expulsion and long-term suspension is removal from the school for greater than 10 days. In the event that this is recommended for a child with a disability, a manifestation determination must be held within 10 days of the recommendation to suspend a student. If during manifestation determination it's determined that the behavior is not related to the child's disability, the suspension can be carried out as if it would for a student without a disability. However, the student must have access to the general education curriculum and continue to receive IEP services during their suspension. If it's determined during manifestation determination that the behavior is related to the student's disability, the students return to their current placement and an FBA is completed and a BIP is developed. IDEA created an exception to the stay put provision that allows a school to remove a student from school who may pose as a danger to themselves or others. If a student possesses or intends to use a weapon can be considered any object a student intends to use to cause harm to another. This could be a pencil or a standard weapon like a knife or a gun. If the student possesses or takes illicit drugs or intends to sell them on campus, or purposely inflicts serious bodily harm to another, causing injury or mutilation, these can be reasons that a student can be placed in an interim alternative education setting, or IAES. A school can unilaterally place a student in an IAES for up to 45 days while an appropriate placement can be agreed upon by the IEP team. A manifestation determination meeting must be held in all instances where the school recommends an IAES. If the behavior is a direct result of the student's disability, they must return to the previous placement and an FBA and BIP must be completed. A school can suspend a student with a disability for up to 10 days while the team determines if the behavior manifests from the student's disability. A school can also request an expedited due process hearing to place a student in an IAES if they have not committed one of the 3 code of conduct violations listed on this slide, but the school still feels the student's a danger to themselves or others in another way. The expedited hearing must take place within 20 days of the request, and a decision must be made by the hearing officer within 10 days. Homebound is one of the IAES options. However, it's not the favorable option because it is the most restrictive and socially isolating. If a student is placed homebound due to disciplinary issues, the student must continue to receive FAPE, a manifestation determination must be held, and an FBA and BIP must be completed. It's important to remember the 10-day rule when disciplining students with special needs. Removal from school exceeding 10 days is considered a placement change according to IDEA. Whether consecutive or non-consecutive in school without services, or for part of the day, or from busing if transportation is on the student's IEP, removal for more than 10 days is considered a change in placement and the procedures must be followed. Thank you for taking the time to review this PowerPoint with me. If you have any questions related to the presentation, please email them to me at the address listed on this slide. I appreciate your help with this, and if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.